Baron Trump never asked to inherit a name, but one quiet evening his father called him into a room where no one ever entered. There he handed him a tape that had never been played, a journal that had never been read, and a secret about a brother the world had long forgotten. What followed wasn't about politics. It was about a fractured legacy, a buried truth, and a moment when a father finally stopped performing and revealed to his son who he truly was. It was the kind of revelation that changes everything, not with noise but with the suffocating weight of silence. The sun was dipping below the horizon in Palm Beach, casting golden hues across the still surface of the private pool. The windows of Mar-a-Lago caught the fading light, glowing as if the mansion itself were on fire. Yet, despite the spectacle outside, the house was quiet, eerily quiet. Inside, the silence wasn't filled with reverence. It was guarded, like the house itself was holding its breath, afraid of disturbing the illusion it had spent years constructing. Baron Trump moved through the house with a grace that spoke of restraint. Tall, reserved, he was like a ghost weaving through the chandeliered rooms. He didn't walk like someone who belonged there. He walked like someone trying not to disturb the delicate facade of perfection. At 19, Baron was no longer the awkward, misunderstood kid the world had once speculated about. He had grown lean and sharp-featured, more like his mother than his father. His voice, when he chose to speak, was deep, patient, and measured, never hurried or brash, like he had learned to observe life from behind a two-way mirror. He didn't post on social media. He didn't argue. He didn't play the game. He simply watched, and tonight he was watching his father eat dinner alone at the long mahogany table. Donald Trump did not tolerate silence. He filled it, much like a general fills a parade ground, with commands, with action, with noise. But recently his presence had grown quieter, slower. That night, as Baron observed his father from across the room, Donald looked up unexpectedly and said something Baron never expected to hear. "Stay a minute." Baron blinked in surprise. "Sure." He sat down across from the man the world never stopped looking at. The room smelled faintly of scotch and polished wood, the smell of expensive dinners and secretive conversations. The clink of silverware against fine china echoed in the spacious room like it didn't quite belong, out of place in the heavy silence. Donald didn't look up. He simply cut another piece of steak, continuing in a quiet tone, "Do you know where your name came from?" Baron tilted his head slightly, a curious expression on his face. "Why did you name me that?" Donald nodded, his eyes still on his plate. "I had an alias. Used it when I wanted privacy. John Baron. Used to call reporters, pretending to be someone else. They always believed me," he said with a faint smile. Baron said nothing, only listening as his father continued. "I liked the name," Donald went on. "It sounded clean, strong. Someone you couldn't ignore." Finally, Donald looked up, locking eyes with Baron for the first time that night. "But you're not like that, are you?" Baron didn't flinch. He just sat there, staring back, waiting for the next words to fall. Donald leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you want me to be?" Baron's expression remained unchanged, but there was something deeper, more searching in his eyes now. Donald's question hung in the air for a moment before he answered, surprising them both. "No," Donald said quietly, I think I'm tired of people trying to be someone they're not." The words were unexpected, almost foreign, coming from a man who had spent so much of his life building an empire out of carefully curated images and performances. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, of truth, and it reverberated in the stillness between father and son. For the first time there was no facade. There was just silence, and a shared understanding that was more profound than anything either of them had expected to confront that evening. A heavy silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but vast, stretching like an empty chasm. Then Donald stood, his voice breaking the stillness. "Come with me." Baron hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, but because it had never happened before. His father didn't invite people in. He summoned them, or sent others in his place. But tonight, Donald motioned for Baron to follow. They moved down a narrow hallway, past the portrait room, past a corridor lined with mirrors where the staff rarely ventured. At the far end stood a small, inconspicuous door with a keypad. Donald punched in a code, the lock clicked, and with a swift motion he opened the door and gestured for Baron to enter. Inside was a room starkly different from the opulent spaces of Mar-a-Lago. No gold, no velvet. Just a heavy wooden desk, a bookshelf lined with dusty volumes, a file cabinet, and in the corner, a tape player, an old cassette player, relic of another era. Baron glanced around, confused, trying to make sense of the scene. Donald walked to the desk, opened a drawer and pulled something out. A small box. Inside were a photograph, a letter, and a tape. Donald held the photograph out to Baron. It was of a young man in a pilot's jacket, a smile on his wind-blown face, eyes soft and innocent. "That's Freddie," Donald said quietly. Baron frowned, uncertain. "Who?" Donald's voice dropped, almost inaudible. "My older brother." Baron froze. His father rarely spoke of family, of anything before the buildings, the cameras, the empire. But now Donald's gaze drifted to a dust-covered photograph on the shelf, and Baron saw something in his father's eyes he'd never seen before. A sadness, a vulnerability he hadn't known existed. "He died before you were born," Donald continued, his voice low and rough. "He drank himself to death." Donald ran a hand over his face, the weight of the words settling between them. He didn't want to be a part of the business. He wanted to fly planes, be free. Another pause. "I mocked him for it." Baron sat down slowly, the room suddenly feeling heavier, as though something buried long ago was being unearthed. He looked at the tape. "What's on it?" Donald hesitated. "I don't know. He mailed it to me once, years before he died. I never listened to it." Baron raised his eyes to his father. "Why not?" Donald looked away, his eyes hardening as though the answer itself was a bitter memory. After a long silence, he spoke, voice thick with the weight of untold stories. "Because I already knew what he'd say." That night, after Baron went to bed, he lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the moments of the evening, the room, the photo, the tape, like fragments of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. He could still see his father standing there, holding that letter as if it weighed more than any lawsuit, any scandal, any headline. For the first time, Baron saw him not as a towering figure of power, not as a wall of sound, but as a man who had once loved someone who hadn't wanted to be him, and had lost him. Baron sat up in bed, his heart racing. He grabbed a piece of hotel stationery and quickly wrote a note. "I want to hear the tape with you." He folded it, slipped it under the door of the small room where Donald often stayed when he wanted privacy from the press, and then returned to his bed. He waited for the knock that he knew would come. The next morning, the world outside Mar-a-Lago shimmered with the polished elegance it always had. The staff moved quietly through the halls, sunlight spilling through the high arched windows, breaking into golden streams that seemed to highlight the house's grandiosity. The headlines screamed somewhere else, but inside the room at the end of the hallway, the room few knew even existed, the world stood still. Donald Trump sat in a worn leather chair, arms crossed. The cassette tape was already in the player, but his finger hadn't yet pressed play. The envelope with Baron's note sat folded in his lap, the words on it echoing in his mind, "I want to hear the tape with you." It was a strange sentence, neither a plea for connection nor a demand for answers, but something else entirely. It made Donald's throat tighten in a way he hadn't expected. He hadn't expected it. A knock. He looked up, the door creaked open softly and Baron entered, moving quietly, no fanfare, no entourage, no cameras. Just a son and a father, alone in a room where words had been buried for decades. The atmosphere was thick with silence as they stood facing each other, neither of them quite sure how to bridge the gap. Baron spoke first, his voice steady, but with an edge of uncertainty. "Ready?" Donald hesitated for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing on him, before he reached forward and pressed play. The tape crackled to life and for a moment, there was only silence, a deep, heavy pause before a voice, soft, measured, and with a hint of mischief buried beneath its tone, emerged from the speakers. "Hey Donnie." The room seemed to freeze. "I figured you'd never listen to this, but I'm recording it anyway," the voice continued, warm and familiar. "You were always better at headlines than I was. You had the spark, the swagger, you filled rooms I didn't want to. I liked the quiet. I liked the sky." Donald closed his eyes, the voice pulling him back into a past he had locked away. It wasn't haunting, but it tore at him in a way that he hadn't anticipated. A voice he hadn't heard in so long, but a voice that cut through him like a blade. "I know you think I gave up. Maybe I did. But not the way you think. I didn't die because I was weak. I died because I couldn't make peace with pretending." There was a sharp intake of breath. "And I see you now, on television, in the papers. I just keep wondering, do you remember who we were before we picked sides?" Baron glanced sideways at his father, whose face remained unreadable, eyes focused tightly on the tape as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored. His hands were folded, his posture rigid. It wasn't anger that tightened his jaw, but something deeper, an aching focus, as if every word from the tape was chiseling away at a wall he had built around himself. Freddie's voice continued, steady and calm, but laden with a sadness that seemed to seep into every syllable. I don't want anything from you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to tell someone the truth one day. Not the truth about me. Not about the company. Not even about Dad. The truth about you. The tape clicked. Side A had ended. The room was completely still. No one moved, not even a breath. Then Donald stood up slowly, his face drawn, the weight of Freddie's words pulling him forward like gravity. He walked to the shelf, picked up the letter Freddie had sent along with the tape. It was still sealed, untouched. He held it to his chest for a moment, as if trying to absorb the gravity of everything that had been said, the past that was now laid bare. Then, without a word, he handed the letter to Baron. In that moment, a flood of emotions washed over the room: regret, understanding, and the silent acceptance that nothing would ever be the same again. Baron hesitated, his fingers lightly touching the edge of the letter. "You read it," Donald urged, his voice low but firm. Baron took a slow breath, his mind racing. "Are you sure?" he asked, as if doubting whether he should be the one to uncover the truth. Donald simply nodded, his eyes steady, unwavering. Baron unfolded the letter, his gaze tracing the short handwritten paragraph within. No signature. Just words simple yet profound. "If you're reading this, then you're the only person who can break the loop. I lived like I didn't matter. You lived like you had to matter to everyone. We were both wrong. The truth is simple, you mattered even when you were quiet." Baron looked up, his eyes meeting Donald's, searching for something more, something that could explain it all. He spoke, the words tentative but clear. "I think he wanted you to tell that to someone." Donald didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Baron for a long moment, his face hard, the weight of the past hanging between them like a thick fog. In that moment, Donald looked older, not in years but in the burden of everything he'd kept hidden. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice quieter than Baron had ever heard it before. "I've told a lot of people a lot of things, but never told anyone that." Baron folded the letter in his hands, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. He held it for a second longer, then met his father's eyes. "Tell me," he said, the words heavy with the unspoken plea for understanding, for truth. Donald sat back down, his face etched with an expression Baron had never seen. He took a long, deep breath, his eyes flickering with something between regret and revelation. "I was afraid I'd lose myself," Donald began, his voice barely a whisper. "If I ever stopped performing, if I ever stopped pretending." He paused, his jaw tightening. "The world doesn't give you credit for being quiet. They walk past you, forget you. I wasn't going to let them forget me. But Freddie, he didn't care if people forgot him. He just wanted to be free. And I punished him for that. For being what I couldn't be." The words were raw. Not emotional but something deeper, more visceral. They cut through the air, unpolished and unguarded, revealing a vulnerability that Donald Trump had spent his life hiding. Baron leaned forward, captivated by the rawness in his father's voice, the unspoken truth finally spilling out. "You were just scared, weren't you?" Baron asked softly, his voice filled with a tenderness he rarely showed. Donald blinked hard, the weight of the question settling over him like a wave. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Every day." The room remained still, heavy with silence, as the last words of the tape echoed in their minds. No movement, no sound, just a father and son sitting together in a space where the truth had finally come to light. A space where old wounds were laid bare. Donald stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if each step was a struggle. He walked to the window, his reflection staring back at him. Older, grayer, sharper than he remembered. For the first time he seemed vulnerable, as if the walls he had built around himself had crumbled. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of secrets. "I never told anyone about that room. Not even your mother." The room grew colder in the silence that followed. And for the first time, Baron saw his father not as a figure of power, but as a man who had carried the burden of too many unspoken truths for far too long. Baron sat in silence, his gaze fixed on his father. He nodded slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Why now?" he asked in his mind, but the words never escaped his lips. Donald didn't answer right away. He stood, his movements deliberate, slow, as though he were gathering the courage to open a door that had been shut for too long. Then, turning to face Baron, he spoke with a quiet but resolute voice. "Because, for the first time," Donald paused, taking in a deep breath, "I don't feel like I'm hiding behind myself when I talk to you." With that, he opened a drawer, one that had remained closed for longer than either of them could remember. He reached inside and pulled out something wrapped in a faded, time-worn cloth. His fingers touched it gently as if it were fragile, precious. He laid it on the table before Baron and unwrapped it with care. Inside there was a leather-bound journal, small, aged, the spine barely holding together as if it had been passed through the hands of time itself. On the front, written in faded ink, was a name, Frederick Trump. Donald's fingers lingered on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. Freddie wrote this when he was in rehab, Donald said, his voice tinged with an old, unspoken pain. I visited him once. He gave it to me. I never opened it. He paused, as if weighing the significance of what he was about to say next, before continuing with a voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid of what I'd find. Baron reached forward instinctively, but something held him back. His fingers hovered above the journal, uncertain. Donald's eyes met his, damp but not broken, just open. He wasn't alone anymore. Are you ready now? Donald asked quietly. Baron nodded, unsure of what to expect. Together they opened the journal, page by page. The words within weren't angry or sad. They were observations, fragments of a life lived in quiet rebellion, moments captured in ink. There were memories, fears, and fleeting truths. Freddie's handwriting was careful, but raw. Donnie always wanted to be bigger than the room. I just wanted to sit still and breathe without someone asking why. He laughs like a hammer. I laugh like a window creaking. Baron felt the weight of the words. They weren't just observations, they were confessions. I think we both wanted the same thing Freddie had written. To not be alone. As they moved deeper into the journal, one page stood out. The handwriting was larger, more hurried, as if written in a rush, a last desperate plea. If I don't make it, give this to someone who still has a chance to choose. Don't give it to someone who wants the world. Give it to someone who wants to feel what's real inside it. Donald closed the journal carefully, his fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. His eyes met Baron's, and without saying another word, he let out a quiet breath, as if releasing something long held inside. That's you, Donald said, his voice low but steady. Baron was silent for a long time. The weight of his father's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, Is that why you brought me in here? Donald nodded slowly. I didn't want to give you a brand, a company, or a last name. His voice cracked just slightly as he continued, I wanted to give you this. Before the world told you what you had to be. Outside, the rain began to fall, slow and warm, a southern rain that didn't demand shelter, only attention. The soft patter against the windows seemed to mirror the quiet intensity of the moment. Donald sat back down, his eyes fixed on Baron, not through the lens of a dynasty but through something far older, more primal. In that moment he was just a father, reaching across time, trying to bridge the gap between them. He spoke again, more gently this time. He wasn't weak, you know? Baron nodded, his gaze unwavering. I know. Donald looked at him for a long moment as if searching for the right words. And you're not silent because you're scared. Baron met his father's gaze, his voice quiet but firm. I'm silent because I don't want to speak someone else's words. For the first time, Donald didn't reply. There was nothing more to say. The rain continued to fall outside, and inside, father and son sat together in a silence that spoke volumes. A silence filled with understanding, with connection, and with a truth that neither of them had ever expected to find. Donald exhaled deeply, his breath slow and heavy, as if the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. He looked at his son, his eyes filled with something almost unrecognizable, pride, but also something gentler, more vulnerable. That's braver than anything I've ever done, he said quietly. That night, Donald didn't watch the news, he didn't post anything on social media, and he didn't take a single call. Instead, he sat alone in the old room, the lights dimmed low, the air still and heavy with thought. The tape sat beside him on the table, rewound to its beginning. The journal, worn and fragile, rested in his hands as he whispered, almost to himself, Freddie? I told him. You were right. He was the one to give it to. For the next 3 days, Baron barely spoke. It wasn't out of rebellion or shock, but out of deep reverence. The journal, now an artifact of something so intimate and raw, became his constant companion. He carried it carefully as though it might vanish if dropped too quickly. He didn't open it in public, didn't mention it when people asked what he was reading. He kept it close to his side like a compass, something he hadn't yet figured out how to use but instinctively knew he would need. At night, he would sit outside on the veranda, earbuds in, pretending to listen to music. But he wasn't really listening. He was thinking about the voice on the tape, the cracked gentleness in Freddie's words and the rare tremble in his father's voice. It felt like someone had handed him a broken violin and told him there was music inside it, but it was up to him to find the way to play it. Donald hadn't said much since the day they listened to the tape together. He didn't return to the room with the tape. He didn't bring up the journal, but something inside him had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. He didn't speak in slogans that week. He didn't bark out orders. He didn't overtalk as he often did. He lingered longer in doorways as if giving space to his thoughts. He waited just a moment longer before responding, a quiet reflection that wasn't lost on Barron. Once at breakfast, Donald asked Barron a question without interrupting him. Halfway through his answer, Barron noticed the difference, the rare and tender shift in his father's demeanor. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. On the fourth morning, Barron opened the journal again. This time he flipped toward the back and discovered a page folded in half. When he unfolded it, the words inside struck him with quiet power. If someone ever tells you that you have to be loud to be strong, give them silence that doesn't back down. If they tell you men don't feel, show them a bruise you didn't hide. And if they hand you a legacy covered in gold, ask them what part of it bleeds. Barron read the words twice, his heart heavy with their weight. The silence that followed felt sacred. He closed the journal slowly as if he were sealing something precious inside it. Then, with quiet determination, he walked downstairs. His father was in the study, seated in his usual place, reading, not tweeting, not making calls. Barron leaned against the doorframe, looking at the man he had always known, yet now seeing him through a lens that was somehow sharper, clearer. "Can I ask you something?" Barron's voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in it that hadn't been there before. Donald looked up from his reading, his eyes meeting Barron's with a quiet intensity. "Anything," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew that this moment, whatever it was important. Barron held the journal in his hands, the leather worn and familiar, the weight of it a constant reminder of everything unspoken between them. He looked at his father, his voice steady but laden with a question that had been buried for years. "Did he ever tell you he loved you?" Donald paused. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No," he muttered, the word hanging in the air like an echo. "But I think he did, in the way he looked at me when I was trying to win." Barron stepped into the room, the floor creaking beneath his feet. His gaze never left Donald, his voice quiet but insistent. "Do you know the last time you looked at me that way?" A silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Donald's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he set the paper down. Standing slowly, he walked around the desk, his steps deliberate. When he finally looked Barron in the eye, there was something different about his gaze, something unspoken, a quiet truth in the way he held his son's stare. "I'm looking at you that way now," he said, his voice steady, without the theatrics that so often colored his words. There were no tears. There was no grand emotional outpouring. But in that moment, something passed between them, a connection deeper than words, something that didn't need to be loud to be real. Barron nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of it, and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he stopped and placed the journal back on the desk. "You can finish it," he said softly, his words carrying a quiet finality. "I've memorized my part." That night, Donald sat alone in the dim light of the study. He opened the journal, but not as one might read a book. He opened it like a mirror, examining every word, every mark that his brother had left behind. The small ones, the angry ones, the beautiful, broken, unfinished ones that spoke of a life lived too quickly, a soul left untended. His fingers traced the edges of the pages as though trying to grasp at something that had always slipped through his hands. He turned to the last page. For the first time in years he picked up a pen and began to write. The words came slowly, but they were his truth, raw and unpolished. "Freddie, thank you. You gave me something my billions never could, a second chance to be honest, to be still, to be a father. I'll try to get it right this time." When he finished, he sat back in his chair, the weight of the words settling over him like a heavy blanket. For the first time in a long time he felt like he had done something real. The next morning, Barron woke to find a slip of paper slipped under his door. His name was written on it in large, familiar handwriting. The simplicity of the message was all it needed to be. "Let's go somewhere quiet today, just us." They drove without the usual entourage, no Secret Service, no guards, no cameras. For the first time in months, it was just them, father and son, lost in the world together. They took back roads, the hum of the engine the only sound between them, until they ended up at a small beach Donald hadn't visited since he was a teenager. There were no reporters, no noise, just the wind in the air and the rhythmic crash of the waves. They walked side by side, not needing to speak much, just existing in the presence of one another. Donald picked up a stone, studied it for a while, then tossed it into the waves. "You know," he said quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the surf, "the ocean's the only thing that ever made me feel small. And I think that's why I avoided it for so long." Baron didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the weight of his father's words sink in as the waves rolled in and out, pulling everything back to the sea. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was comfortable in a way only shared experience could create. Together, they stood in that quiet, the only sounds the wind, the waves, and the unspoken bond growing stronger between them. Baron crouched down at the edge of the shore, his eyes fixed on the waves as they pulled back, revealing the smooth, dark sand beneath. He watched, his mind caught between the relentless rhythm of the sea and the quiet stirrings inside him. His father, standing beside him, suddenly turned toward him, his voice soft but clear. "Small doesn't mean weak." Baron's gaze shifted, studying the way the tide came and went, and he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the ocean that carried strength. "It means honest," he thought. The truth of it settled in him like a stone, heavy but sure. As the tide rolled back in, bringing with it the promise of yet another cycle, Baron did something he had never done before. Without hesitation, he reached out and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. It wasn't an act of pity, nor was it a son's act of forgiveness. It was something deeper. It was the quiet, unspoken gesture of a man, looking into the eyes of another and saying, "I see you." Donald didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. Instead, he placed his hand gently on top of Baron's, and for a long moment, they stood in the stillness, watching the waves together. 3 months later, the estate had returned to its usual quiet, but this time, it wasn't because the media had stopped chasing them. It was because they had stopped running. The story never broke. No one ever found out about the room at the end of the hallway, the tape, or the journal. The silence held, a secret wrapped tightly because some things Baron now understood aren't meant to be shared with the world. They're meant to be kept, hidden away in the hearts of the few who are strong enough to carry them. Baron still carried the letter Freddie had written. It was folded carefully and tucked in his wallet, next to an old photo of his mother and a small, almost childish drawing from his childhood, something he had made on the back of a campaign flyer. A stick figure, drawn simply in black ink, stood alone, holding a balloon labeled "Me." For years he hadn't understood why he kept it. But now, as he ran his fingers over the worn edges of the letter, it became clear. It wasn't the drawing that had mattered, it was the message in it. "I am here even if no one notices." Donald didn't speak of Freddie again after that week. Not directly. But Baron began to notice small things. Little changes in his father's behavior that spoke volumes. In interviews, Donald would pause before answering, a full minute of silence that felt heavy with meaning. He would hold back from correcting someone immediately, taking a moment to reflect. There was one instance during a meeting with former advisors when someone made a snide comment about Baron's quietness. Instead of leaping to his son's defense as he might have in the past, Donald simply looked at them and said, his voice calm and firm, "Still water reflects the sky better." The room went quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. No one dared speak after that, and the way Donald's voice lingered made sure it stayed that way. It was as if, in those moments, the world had shifted ever so slightly. There was something new in the way he carried himself, something soft and steady, like the deep, unbroken silence between the waves and the shore. And Baron, watching it all, knew that the quiet had changed them both in ways the world would never understand. On the evening of Baron's 20th birthday, Donald called him outside. The sky stretched out before them, bathed in golden light, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. The clouds hung like heavy silk, thick and weighted, painting the sky with shades of amber and violet. They stood at the edge of the garden path, where the grass was soft beneath their feet, the air warm but carrying the faintest hint of salt from the sea. There were no guards, no cameras, just the two of them standing in the quiet between father and son. Donald reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out something worn and familiar. The journal, its leather cover softened with age and use, the pages dog-eared and marked. He handed it to Baron without a word, and for a long moment they stood there, the world around them hushed as if waiting. "I added something," Donald said, his voice quieter than usual. "Just one page." Baron opened the journal, the pages turning easily in his hands. He reached the back and stopped, his eyes scanning the words written in bold, careful handwriting, words that were weightier than anything he'd ever read before. "To my son. I've built towers, brands, and a name that may outlive us both, but this is the first thing I ever built that was just for you. Not to impress you. Not to teach you. Just to show you that I knew, finally, that being your father mattered more than any crowd I ever stood in front of. I may not have many days left to rewrite history, but I have enough time to tell you the truth. I am proud of the man you are becoming because you are building quietly, and that takes more strength than I ever had. Baron paused, his hands trembling slightly as he held the journal to his chest. He felt the weight of his father's words settle into his bones, heavy but not oppressive. He spoke softly, his voice breaking the stillness of the moment. "Thank you for not leaving this buried." Donald nodded slowly, his eyes not meeting Baron's but his voice steady. "Thank you for asking for it." Later that night, Baron found himself alone on the balcony, staring up at the stars as they blinked to life, one by one. He didn't know what his future looked like. The weight of that uncertainty hung in the air around him, thick and full of questions. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want to inherit the machinery of an empire that seemed built on noise and spectacle. But as he stood there, a sense of clarity washed over him, soft and unspoken. He wasn't sure what path he would take, but he now held something far more valuable than power. He held a choice. A real choice. And in the quiet of that night, a decision came to him. Not in thunder, not in a flash of brilliance, but in a calm, steady peace. He wouldn't build louder. He wouldn't build faster. He would build slower with intention. He would listen before speaking. He would speak only when it mattered. And he would be the first Trump to be remembered, not for the noise he made but for the silence he kept. Inside the house, across the hall, Donald sat in the study. The journal was gone now, passed on to Baron, but in its place on his desk was a single photograph, one of Freddie smiling in a moment of unguarded joy. Beside it was a more recent photo of Baron, standing by the sea, his face calm, reflective. Donald looked from one photo to the other, his eyes lingering between the two men. His brother, his son, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to breathe, to feel the shift that had occurred. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "The loop is broken." If you enjoyed this heartwarming story, like and subscribe to Hidden Raylit for more.